Start the recording. Perfect. All right, with that, thank you everybody for coming. Really appreciate you coming to our first Environmental Justice Symposium. I'm Kevin and this is Bridget, and we'll be your hosts for this talk with Dr. Christine Folch. I'm so happy to have you. And Dr. Folch is an assistant professor of cultural anthropology at Duke. She's a scholar of energy politics, natural resources, and environment in Latin America, with an attention to how nature is intertwined with power struggles, national identities, and history. Her new book, Hydropolitics, the Itaipú Dam, Sovereignty and the Engineering of Modern South America, draws on more than a decade of ethnography among energy elites in Paraguay, as well as Brazil, as they administer the resources of the world's largest hydroelectric dam to show how electricity is tied up with politics and sovereignty. Here at Duke, Dr. Folch teaches her students about energy, environment, and plants in the Anthropology department. Thank you so much for coming. And with that, take it away.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to thank everybody for showing up in the middle of the day on a Saturday, which is actually a kind of nice Saturday, but perhaps it's because you're in a stay-in-place order and you're like, well, I might as well. So I want to thank you all, and I want to acknowledge that I think that this is a challenging moment for us. We're 1 year in to an experiment that was unimaginable, like in January of 2020. And so I particularly thank you for that. I think that as a result of the moments of crisis are moments of clarity and transformation. And one of the things that has happened as a result of the moment of crisis that we've been in the United States, in the world in the last year, is that we have started to feel more broadly an urgency to talk about topics that were talked about disparately together. And so I think at the heart of this symposium, so not just my session of it, but the invitation that you all have given is an ability to pull together things that it's a topic, right? Environmental justice is a topic, but so frequently conversations about justice are on one side and conversations about, I really like butterflies, are on another side. And so I think that thanks to, and not thanks to, some of the incredible violence that we have seen in the last year in the murder of George Floyd, and in the ongoing violence to minority communities in the United States where I live, but in other parts of the world. So that's sort of who the minority communities are and what the violence looks like is different in different places. But I think because we've been so focused on a screen in front of us or a screen in front of us, we've started to see some things that perhaps were less visible to us. And so I think the committee that has put this together for taking advantage of this moment. And I do hope that what we do here is take a step in a direction rather than think that we've, through Zoom, resolved the problem of environmental justice. So the talk that I'm going to give today is entitled Why Stories Matter: Decolonizing Nature and Environmental Justice. So it's got something that I hope sounds like normal humans, and then speech, and then decolonizing nature, which is actually what I want to do, but I want to show us what that means rather than just talk about it. So I want to talk today about, so the invitation was, Dr. Folch, come and speak about whatever you want. You do this research in Latin America on energy politics and et cetera, environmental justice in Latin America, et cetera. So maybe talk about that. And then I spent some time thinking about you and thinking about where you all are, and the year that you have had and the moment that you are in your lives. And I want to walk with you a little bit about why I think stories matter, why I think your stories matter, and why I think it's really important to listen to stories that are different from the stories we often hear. I want to start by saying what I think justice means. I think of justice as right relationship. Right relationship with self, with other living beings, with mystery, with the planet, with the universe. It's right relationship. And I want that to be at the center of what we're talking about, because stories are central to right relationship. And so I want us to think about the stories that we know and think about the stories that we tell as a way of, justice is not just righting wrongs. It is much, much, much more positive than that. It's a path forward, not just a corrective of the past. And so I want to argue that stories about nature really matter for environmental justice. And I want to argue also that diversity matters and that diverse stories matter for environmental justice, for right relationship. And I want to not just argue that, I want to show us what that might look like today. And I want to call us to, sometimes when we talk about diverse stories, sometimes it feels like we talk about like that's good because it means like we're woke, or it means like we're like, smart, or like, I don't know, it's like sort of there's like advertising around it. It's like it looks prettier to be diverse or something like that. And I'm not making an argument like that. I actually want to show us why it's actually a life and death issue to have diverse stories being told about these issues, that it's actually the way forward. It's not just ethically awesome that we're this way, that we're listening to diverse stories. It's actually the only way through. It's actually how to solve the problem. That is what I want to argue. So I want to tell some stories. And the first story I want to tell is a story through actually an exercise together. So those of us who are on this call, I'm going to ask you a question. And I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to do a dorky exercise, or maybe a brilliant exercise that I like to do with students in my classes. And we'll see how it goes. And as Kevin also remarked, if you've got questions or comments that you want to also sort of you're like, oh, it made me think of this, or I have this question, please feel free to use the chat. So the first thing I want to do is I want to do an exercise that I do actually in my classes, which, I prefer to use like a chalkboard, and I prefer chalkboards to whiteboards, but like old fashioned in that way. But we don't have that, so we're just gonna have to use the whiteboard on my screen here. And I just want to hear your answers to this question. So, okay, I'm gonna write a word on this whiteboard, and I want you to say out loud what comes to mind. Ooh, look, it automatically was green. That's kind of amazing. All right, I need you to fill this page like with free associating whatever comes to mind when you hear the word nature. I'm looking for like 30 answers, so go for it. Nature, free associate for me.
Mountains.
Mountains, awesome. 29 more, let's go.
We have some greens in the chat.
Okay.
And tree.
Okay, and if you all want to write stuff on it like you're doing right now, you all are so awesome. Go for it. So we have greens. Yep. Nature.
We have tree. We have birds.
Okay.
We have peaceful.
Oh, this is good. This is really good. Nature.
Animals, flowers.
Yeah. Nature.
Air, waterways, sky, fish, and birds chirping.
Guys, okay. Also, this imagery here, like where you've got like just not just nouns, but like nouns and a gerund. or in maybe present participle in this point. Like, this is really good. Let's throw out more of this. I want more of this. What comes to mind as you think of nature? What are those things? Let's free associate. Let's fill this with the imagery is coming to mind. No filter. No filter. Nature.
We also have clean air. We have litter, which is interesting.
Great. No, like no, absolutely no filtering right now. Litter.
Meadows, green grass, deer.
Okay, meadows, green grass. Oh, come on. Deer, nature.
Rivers, romantic poets.
Awesome.
Patagonia.
Patagonia. Do you mean the brand or do you mean the place? Person who said Patagonia, do you mean the brand?
Emily McGinty says the brand.
Okay.
Gardening.
Gardening. I mean, this is really good. This is really, really, really good. Let's give some more. You're all doing a wonderful, wonderful job. You're actually doing exactly what I want you to do. So I want to thank you for this. Give me more. What comes to mind when you think of the word nature?
Sierra Nevadas, as in the mountain range. Fire, hiking, wild.
Oh, this is good, you all. Hiking, not hiring, sorry. Wild.
Parking lots.
Wild. Parking lot. Nature. Don't edit, bring it. It's so good.
I personally think of the ocean and the beach.
Ocean. Beach. Nature.
Climate change, that's me too.
Fine too. I'm asking whatever comes to mind, right? So we're doing something where rather than censoring ourselves, we need to put out what we're thinking or what comes to mind. And so you're like, oh, this is silly. It's a great answer because we're doing something really important together. I know it doesn't feel like it yet, but we are. Nature, what comes to mind for you?
There's the Audubon Society. Ecosystem services. Outside recreation.
Outside or outside recreation?
Outside and recreation are separate words.
Awesome. Thank you.
We have weeping willows.
Nature.
Quiet. Transcendentalist ideas.
You guys are so good. Transcendentalist ideas.
Fresh air. Environment. National park.
This is really good. You all are so great. This is why it's such a joy to like teach at Duke.
Bird watchers.
Yeah.
Preserved places. Backpacking. Solitude. Painted landscapes.
Painted landscapes.
Rocks. Wildflowers. In addition to national parks, there's also white men who made national parks.
White what?
White men who made national parks.
White man-made national parks, is that what it was?
Yeah, pretty much. Picnics. And earthworms.
Did you all know that the earthworms that we live with here are like not indigenous to the Americas, but actually implants from Europe? American American earthworms are like much thinner and smaller. This is something I learned from a soil scientist here. So if you see the big fat earthworms that you're thinking about, those are from Europe. So
I had no idea.
Yeah. So what that means is you can, from earthworms, you can tell something about habitation and agriculture. Yeah. And that's not actually what I study, but I like to geek out on stuff. Okay, so we're in a good place right now. I think we've got a lot. And what I want us to do is, so Kevin was like super, super awesome and like voiced what you all have said. I want to ask you, so what we've done together is we've actually told a story in many ways. We've told a story about nature. We've told a story about what we imagine as nature. And so there are no judgments. I just was like, let's put this thing out here. Okay, so now I want to ask you to analyze this with me. Maybe that's not what you wanted to do, but you're at a symposium on a Saturday. I know that you care about this. What your presence here tells me that you really care about this, or that you lost a bet, in which case, too bad. So I want to ask you a question. Let's look for what story does this exercise tell? These words that we free associated with the word nature just happened to be that I was writing in green. It really was not like intentional. I want to ask you a question. What are patterns that you see? What are some commonalities between these words? And so you can write it in the chat and have Kevin read it, but I would also love to hear your voices. And the person who really wants to hear your voices is not me, it's like Kevin. He's all like, yo, please talk. So see, I know these things. It's not because he sent me a private chat, it's because I can read minds. So what patterns do you see in these words? What are some similarities, et cetera, et cetera?
I see a lot of non-human like component parts.
This is great. Non-human component parts. Thank you. What else? What else do you see in this story of nature?
It's also almost all like clean or pristine nature, like nature in its nicest forms.
Okay, nature as clean or pristine, absolutely. And that's also affirmed by the direct words of like clean air or fresh air, but then also the opposite of litter, right? Litter, what litter means is like you threw like the container that your popcorn shrimp came in out the window, right? Like that's what litter means. Oh no, why did you do that into the road and into the little forest, right? Like that's what litter is. So it reaffirms nature as clean and pristine. What else? What are other patterns you see here? Non-human component parts, nature as clean, pristine. What else? What else do you see as patterns between these words?
I feel obligated as the campus farm friend to acknowledge that all of the words are literally like above ground, like nature exists above ground.
Bring it. That's awesome. See, this is why it's worth it to do this with you all on a Saturday. This is great. What else?
Is fun. I want to know what other people think.
I'm super curious. What else? So let's what we're doing here. So what we did is I asked you to throw out lots of words. And now what we're trying to do is we're trying to synthesize by getting to a higher level and finding patterns between them. So we've got non-human component parts. Nature is clean and pristine. Nature as that which is above ground. What else? What else do you see as patterns here?
A lot of them have to do with how humans have interacted with nature. So like parking lots, creating national parks, climate change.
Mm-hmm. That's really great.
And Angela, will you educate me on what terrestrial versus marine bias is? I don't know water things.
Oh, I just meant that terrestrial systems are like overrepresented. There's very few mentions of like coastal and marine specific things.
Okay.
So like earthly versus watery.
Yeah, like land, more land stuff than water stuff.
Thanks.
And some of the water stuff that we have is actually like that which is on predominantly on land, like rivers and waterways. Is that also what you mean? Yeah. Yeah, awesome. That's really good. So just to synthesize some of the stuff that we've said and to repeat it, non-human component parts, nature as clean, pristine, nature, our focus as we're imagining nature here is that which is above ground. And that also then, but that was also the operative word, there was also the word farm. And so farming is absent from, except for gardening, is notably absent in this, which is really interesting because we're, we eat. Humans, so a lot of this is also about some of the humans interacting with nature, either to create parking lots or not national parks or climate change, right? So there's an interesting direction of action. This privileges terrestrial nature rather than coastal or oceanic. They're right, ocean and beach are here, but not, we're like, nobody said seashells. Nobody said waves. Nobody said sand. Nobody said, the smell of salt water. Nobody said tsunamis. Right, like nobody said boats. Nobody said shrimp, except for me. I talked about popcorn shrimp, but then now you know a lot about me. So shrimp is usually one of the correct answers in my life. So it's notable what we didn't. What else do you see as linkages between them? You all are doing really, really good thinking work here.
I'm not sure if Emily wants to mention this out loud or whatnot, so feel free to jump in if you want to say this yourself, but in the chat, she mentioned how it's kind of mind-blowing how we don't think of food as nature.
Come take classes with me. I'm awesome. Remember, shrimp is the answer. Yes. Okay, it's mind-blowing that we don't think about food as nature. Yeah.
I'm also really struck by, and I'm so sorry, who said, Angela, was it you who said that a lot of the nature things are like clean and pristine? And then someone else was like, yeah, but there's also human stuff here, and all the human stuff is like kind of devastating, like litter and white supremacy in national parks. And I think it's like funny that I think of those things as a binary, like very like clean, pristine, or destruction and problems, rather than like deeply intermixed.
Yeah, you all are like awesome. Yeah. So what is missing here? Like lots, right? But so as we've had our conversation and we've looked at what we've said together, and we want to acknowledge a few things about ourselves, right? So I am thoroughly pleased, right? There's like gender diversity, there's sexuality diversity here. There's not that much age diversity. Y'all are young and I'm old enough to be like your mom. I'm not kidding. I know I look good, but truly, like, I was in college when my mom was this age. So, right. So we've got this bimodal, like we're old, and then, you don't need to moisturize as much yet. So we don't have that kind of diversity. We all speak English. We're all, working on a college degree, or hopefully have gotten one already. Then that's why we got a PhD eventually. So we're quite privileged in a certain way. We've been educated and formed in a very particular way. Even as we have an incredible amount of diversity, we have also been funneled into us. Like the reason you got into Duke, unless you're like, you've bombed this call and you're like, I'm having fun just watching this and, who knows, whatever. But I think most of you are like connected to the Duke community, if not everybody is. We have learned to return thought in a certain way that looks smart and gets like, you do well on standardized tests, et cetera, et cetera. So we have been trained. Our minds have been trained in a certain way, and we've been educated in a certain literature and educated in certain values, even as we have diversity in our group, in our midst, which is fine. So I want to argue that what we're seeing here is not just like what the 12 of us who are in this conversation put on the table, that this is actually a good litmus test, and it's representative in interesting ways of how people at Duke, and you all are particularly motivated to think about environment, people. But so I would say that this is probably representative. So I'm going to make this point that like, this is how people who would show up on a Saturday for environmental justice talk about nature. So I want to note and ask the question, what is missing here? What are some silences? You've already started to say some, but we've already said what's here, what's not here, or what do we notice about how we think about nature?
I think one thing is there's a lot of like objects or like abstract objects, but very few like verbs or like actions or interactions.
Okay, that's great. There's nouns. There's a lot of nouns. There aren't a lot of verbs or verby things. Great. What else? What else do you notice? What's missing?
I guess I can hop in. I would notice that there's not like a ton of like description about like interactions with humans, or like how like human systems are like integrated with nature and in the environment. Like you mentioned, like there's no talk about farming or like how we extract resources from nature, or like utilize that to our advantage.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, Kevin, I was thinking, as the person who I like cracked up when you asked me if I meant Patagonia, like the company or the place, because I literally only thought the company, like, and I was like mildly either embarrassed or like, oh my God. Like
my job as a professor to do that to students, to make you be like, ooh. And then
yeah,
like,
I love that, because I was like, holy shit, this isn't, is this being recorded? Sorry.
no, it's okay. Or two, it's okay.
I was like, sorry, because I realized like the human nature connections that come to my mind are sort of like either humans co-opting or like using nature, it could, like you just said, Kevin, in exploitative ways and like not harmonious ways.
Also, I've noticed that like a lot of the descriptions of nature we have here are very like more appealing sides of nature to humans, whereas there's other parts of nature that are like scavengers and parasites and natural disasters and carnivorous animals that are like not mentioned as much. I don't know what the significance of that, but I thought that was interesting.
Yep. So the next thing I want to think about as we're thinking about nature as story and why stories matter is like, what is nature for in what we have said here? What is the purpose of nature? What is it for? That's another way to sort of think through what we're doing here. And I think what Maya said in terms of a notable absence is threat or danger. I think that helps us understand what us 12, but us 12 as emblematic and maybe even on a cutting edge of open-mindedness around nature compared to most people in the United States. So even for us, nature is not about threat. Nature is not about unpleasant things, right? It's not a scavenger, it's not a bloodsucker, it's not a parasite. We talked about earthworms. We didn't talk about like worms inside people's bodies, right? Like That's interesting. What else is missing? Anything else you want to put out there?
I guess like going off of your question of like what is nature used for, like I guess for people based off of these words, it's often like a place of escape where you're supposed to like go and like relax or like rejuvenate yourself. I guess that also like ties into the idea of like national parks and like how it was like kind of like a privileged thing to like you know, escape from like the city to go to nature and like, I don't know, come to terms with yourself or something like, but yeah, those kinds of themes.
Yeah, so we're, you know, it's 12:36, and so I want to make sure that we've got some time to talk about some other stories to help us understand this story. But I want to note, can I say what's missing from nature here? Like humans. People are missing from nature. And so I want to, you know, in terms of thinking about, so the title of the talk for today is that stories matter, or why stories matter. What we've done right now is we've told a story about nature together. And our story about nature has nature as separate from humans, nature as something that is incredibly plant-based. There's some animals, the word animals and bird watchers are humans, but right, there's just a notable absence of humans except for, okay, I guess white supremacist national parks, we'll talk about that as well. Not man-made, white man-made, although potato. White supremacist national parks, nature is a resource for us to reconnect with and be away from humans. It's a place that's quiet. It's a place that has solitude. It's not a place of threat. It's, even if we do like ecosystem services, like what the nature does things for us. And the things that we do for nature are, we preserve it. We do Audubon societies. We backpack through it. We write poetry about it. It's like transcendentalist ideas, romantic poets, etc. We hike through it. What we don't do is we don't live in it. And we're not fundamentally part of it. And that is the fundamental story about nature in the West. The fundamental story, and when I say the West, I'm speaking as, you know, west of Istanbul, right? Istanbul is Houston Street, right? Everything west of it is like west, and everything east of Istanbul is east, right? This classic terminology. In Western thought, a few things, and so I want to talk about the story that we tell. Western thinking is deeply Greco, right? It's deeply Greek. And Western thinking operates in binaries. And the classic binaries of Western thought are rational, irrational, male, female, science, religion, nature, culture. These are classic binaries. And if you're like, oh, I didn't even, oops. Yeah, that's because we're so deeply Western in our thinking. Even if you're like, ooh, I didn't even realize. Those of us who are able to get into a university like Duke know how to think in these ways. And many of us are like, I didn't even know there was a non-way of this thinking. And that's the point of what I want to talk about today. Because I am, you know, I was born in New Jersey. I'm from the United States. Like I'm deeply, deeply Western in thinking. And there's beauty to it, right? Because there's beauty in all kinds of diversity. But we start to see some of the challenges of this story when we immediately ask questions about what is it that we just framed nature as clean, as pristine, as wild, as not human. And humans are therefore not nature. And that means that we can do things to nature and we can do things with nature because we imagine ourselves as separate from it. I'm going to say that again. Our imagination of ourselves as separate from nature means we can do things to nature and we can do things with nature. That mental category has a lot of power. So, you know, what can you do to nature if you're separate from it? You can extract it, you can leave it messy, or you could do the good things, right? Which are preserve it, make it nice. But it's just so, you know, whatever nature is, what humans are doing is not nature. And I think there's something really fascinating about that idea. And this binary dyadic thinking about nature, in addition to allowing certain kinds of actions and certain kinds of deeds, it also, you know, one of the things it has, it's not true, right? I mean, so fundamentally not true. Like, humans are part of nature. Now, yeah, I mean, that feels kind of like obvious in so many ways. And yet what we just did in our imagination, a group of humans who's excited to sit together and talk about environmental justice on a Saturday, we didn't put humans in nature. So what I want to do today is I want to argue for the importance of diverse stories to help us put humans in nature and to understand why it really matters. And so you know, I'm going to tell a quick story about the way we tell the history of the environmentalist movement in the United States, which is reflected in what we just did. And then I want to tell two other stories as a way to understand how diversity in stories helps us see, helps us understand, helps us move towards right relationship, which I argue is the heart of environmental justice, and right relationship with humans, with non-human living things, with non-living non-human things, with cycles, with systems. If you are somebody who is attentive to issues of spirituality with your higher power or powers, right relationship, I'm trying to talk about that is what I talk about when I'm talking about justice. And I think that environmental justice is deeply interwoven in that. So when we often tell the history of the environmentalist movement in the United States, we often tell a story of like degradation, because New York City was nasty 150 years ago, and then a need to create space, and then the expansion of human settlement, you know, from the east to the west, taking over landscapes, and then this realization that you want to conserve and preserve these beautiful landscapes in the United States. And I want to be really honest, we have a beautiful country. And I hope you have the chance and the opportunity to see some of the amazing things in this country. It's a beautiful, beautiful land. It's a beautiful land. And I'm thankful that there have been things set up to protect some of it. But so there's this sort of a realization that you want to create national parks to preserve and to protect things from being overexploited or destroyed, or, you know, they turned into subdivisions. And so the early part of the US environmentalist movement is this: we're conserving and preserving landscapes, and we're hiking through it, we're doing things like Appalachian trails and things like this. Then there's this interesting move from land to animals, where this is the Audubon Society, or this is like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. We start to become aware of, you know, wanting to preserve not just land, but animal diversity. And you know, and so then we see this movement in the 20th century, not just for parks, but in the 20th century, these organizations that grow in the global north, in the North Atlantic world, that then are, you know, really care about like elephants in Africa, and I care about elephants in Africa. But so there's this sort of attention to trying to preserve wildlife. So not just wild places, but wildlife. And then we start to move into the later part of the 20th century, where natural scientists increasingly voice the concern that it's not just that human processes and human chemicals can harm animals, but that actually human processes and human chemicals are actually altering the entire planet. And we've become aware that there's like, you know, anthropogenic climate change. And we knew about this in the 19th century. In the 1800s, we already knew about global warming. So I'm not lying, 19th century. But, you know, in the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st century, it's become much more standard knowledge that human processes have affected not just the local, but the global. And so that's been a really important, and so then all of a sudden, right, it's not just like, I want to conserve Yellowstone or a pretty bird, but all of a sudden, like the scale at which humans need to be worried about preserving and conserving is global. So that's one story that's happening through the environmentalist movement. The environmentalist movement, mirrored in terms of sort of on the sciencey side, tells a story of like conserving landscapes, caring about animals, biology, thinking about ecosystems, thinking about everything's connected. And so if you like take away like, you know, the wolves, what happens is the deer population gets too big and then they eat all the plants and whatever, you know, that whole story. And you know, not whatever, but just like that kind of story. Like there's this awareness of these are not just individual animals, these are things that are linked in processes, and we need to pay attention to processes, et cetera. And then towards the end of the 20th century, there's this awareness that, oh, you know, it's not just that humans pollute on a local scale, they can do things on a global scale. And so humans are affecting ecosystems. And so how do we think about, you know, the impacts of humans on ecosystems? Those are narratives that have humans as separate from nature. They can imagine nature as separate from people. The most cutting edge thinking in the Nicholas School of the Environment or on our side of campus in terms of thinking about, you know, the sciences and human communities and nature. I want to, you know, we're not going to be able to get deep into this right now because we don't have enough time, but I want to signal that some of the most important thinking in this area is actually from people that we have not been paying attention to in our stories of nature. And chiefly in North America, right, there are two categories of people, aside from the category of people called women, that we don't listen to. And those two categories of people are Black people and Indigenous people. And it turns out that when we center the stories of Indigenous people and Black people in North America, it's different in different parts of the world, but in North America, we start to break open that binary of nature versus humans, and we start to see why that story doesn't work. And so I want to close by naming two stories that have to do with Indigenous people and Black people, Indigenous people, or Black people, to help us understand why it is so fundamental to put humans in nature. And my argument is humans are a part of nature. There is no conversation about nature that is not actually also about people, even in people's absence. So I want to show you a picture that maybe this is stuff that you already know, and might not be for others of you. So this is a picture of Seneca Village, but it's like trees and then looks like two white people looking at it, which is kind of appropriate. So in the construction of Central Park, which is a park that's in the middle of Manhattan, and it's sort of the lungs of the city. It's one of the things that gives incredible quality of life to the city, and it's, you know, iconic globally. You know, you get this incredibly advanced city growing and rising, and yet in the middle you have this insistence upon massive amounts of land that is park, and there is no conversation about ever removing this park. No matter how valuable the real estate in New York is, that park stays. It's been a hallmark of a park, not just because it's in movies and not just because you should totally go and visit it if you're in the city, but it's a statement that cities should have parks in them, and massive parks. But the construction of Central Park included the removal of this rectangle area right here, which so this is weird. So this here is north and this here is south, so it's not oriented correctly. It should be like because this is an avenue, so it runs north-south. So Seneca Village was a community, a thriving community of Black people in New York. And most of New York, like the important parts of New York, were much farther south. We're like around Wall Street. And so this is like, and so Wall Street's like in the bottom tip. This here is in the 80s, which is not like, Wall Street's not zero. Wall Street's like -50 in terms of like the roads. And so this is really, really far north. It's a part of the New York that nobody cared about, which is why Black people could live in it and could, these are people who like, you know, auto-liberated themselves from like enslavement. They were living in New York at a time when you could still be like kidnapped back into slavery, even in New York. And what they did is they set up this, this amazing community of hundreds and hundreds of people starting to own homes, starting to build their own network, farms, homes, businesses, etc. And to build Central Park, what the planners decided was like, that's got to go. And so then that was, you know, razed to the ground, and now it looks like this. And the people who lived there, I don't know where they went. We don't know where they went. Some of them stayed in the city. They were compensated to some degree, but obviously that real estate is much, much, much more valuable than whatever they were compensated for. You can't tell a story about Central Park without telling a story of the removal of Black people. And this actually scales out to all of our national parks. So not just something like Central Park in New York. All of our national parks involved the removal of indigenous people from their land in order to build parks that we can then go to and connect, you know, with like nature. If we don't tell the story of the physical removal of indigenous people from Yellowstone, from the Grand Canyon, from the Appalachians, from California, if we don't tell that story, we're telling a really interesting story of nature, because by not placing indigenous bodies in national parks, we're telling a story that, you know, we can imagine a nature that has no people in it, but it's just not chronologically true, right? We had to physically remove people in order to then conserve the space. And then the question becomes, nature for whom? It's clearly not nature for indigenous people. It's clearly not nature for Black people. It's nature for, right? It's nature for people who are closer and closer to whiteness, and whiteness not as something just phenotypical, but something as like a power structure. And so it's really important to put indigenous people and Black people back in nature. And so I want to push this a little farther by sharing my screen again. We're not going to have a ton of time to go into it, but I just want to say, you know, when you think about nature, not as something separate from people, but as something that is totally connected to human communities, all of a sudden you find yourself caring a lot more about what happens in it. And this is right. I think this is so important to environmental justice, to not think of nature as something that you're rescuing, or nature as something that like, or environment as like, you know, a way that you can express racism or a way that you can express injustice, but instead to flip it, to realize that racism and injustice actually always has an environmental angle. It always has an environmental component. Not that you can find examples of racism in environment, and then you can find examples of racism in other things, but instead that fundamentally racism has an environmental component, that injustice fundamentally has an environmental component. And so I'm sharing with you here some images of from the American Indian Museum and the Smithsonian Institute around the issue of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And what I want to signal here is when we center the stories of Indigenous people, the Indigenous people of North America don't work in binaries and dyads because they're not Western. That's not part of the way that they imagine the universe. So rather than having nature and humans are fundamentally part of nature. Totally part of it. It's unimaginable to separate. It'd be like trying to separate you from, like, you know, your arm. I mean, if I separate you from your arm, that's an amputation, and it's an incredibly violent thing. So, and your arm doesn't make it. So even if you do. So Indigenous thinking in North America doesn't have this binary. This is why Indigenous stories really matter, not just because we want to be like woke and it makes us nicer and better people, but because it reveals to us the blind spots in our thinking. And so when you see nature as totally connected to humans, and humans as part of, in relationship with, and brothers and sisters to other living things, and you imagine that other living things doesn't mean just things that have lungs and breathe, but that water is living, and that soil is living, and that mountains are living, all of a sudden you start to see kind of the most cutting edge thinking in terms of the ecological sciences, right? The cutting edge thinking in ecological science realizes that, right, that the earth breathes. Or you could just listen to, like, you know, an Indigenous grandma and she would tell you that. But remember, we don't listen to, there's some stories that we don't listen to because they don't matter as much. And you, right, so cutting edge science realizes that, oh, that, you know, climate change can happen, you can mess up things, it's not good, right? Like, but if you're like, oh, but of course you could, you know, if we're all living together, like, all of it needs to be in relationship and in good, right relationship and harmony, and that is justice. And so, you know, I don't have time to go into the deep story of Standing Rock and the sort of controversy around pipeline that was originally planned to be built about 100 miles, not 100 miles, something around like 50 miles north of the capital city. And then that pipeline track was changed because they were worried that it would get into the water resources used by the city of Bismarck. And instead the path was put to just north of Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota and then South Dakota, because it's okay to, like, you know, contaminate the water resources of these people, but not these people. No conversations about environment are not about people. No conversations about nature are not about people. And therefore, these two conversations have to be woven together. This is why stories matter. Stories matter because they help us see what's missing in our stories. And in what is missing from our stories, that is where we get the breakage points, the fractures that are injustice. The fractures allow injustice to happen. The fractures are where injustice happens. The fractures are the injustice. So that's the story that I wanted to tell today. I want to thank you all for walking with me through it. And I'm open for questions or anything else, but I, you know, do know that it's almost 1 o'clock and I want to let you all go have some lunch or go to the next person. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Folch. Really appreciate that. If everybody could give maybe a virtual round of applause or
thank you to you,
auditory, if you want to unmute yourself.
for participating and for being so in and so connected in spite of how hard I know things are with Zoom. So thank you very, very much.
Great. Are there any questions from the remaining audience?
Yeah, I'll be here if you want to chit chat, but and then I'm not having shrimp today, even though it's on the mind. Thank you to the organizers for making this happen. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.